In this video, we're going to look at drawing your portrait using the grid technique. I'm going to start by going over setting up a grid on a printed out picture and then also show you how to set up a grid on a photo that is still in Photoshop or on your computer. I would recommend using both. That way you can still zoom in on your picture that's on your computer and really look at those details and see a lot better some of the smaller details that might be covered by the grid lines on your printed out picture. But getting started with your printed out picture, just double check the proportions and the sizing of your final picture or your final paper that you're going to be drawing on and compare it to the printed out picture. So right now I'm just going to be working with 8.5 by 11 for both. If you want your final portrait to be larger than 8.5 by 11 or the printer paper size, I would double it so that way you can do 2-inch grid by 2-inch grid on your drawing and then a 1-inch grid by 1-inch grid on your printed out photo. But for the 8.5 by 11 here, I'm doing 1-inch by 1-inch on the printed photo and then 1-inch by 1-inch on my actual portrait to keep the proportions exactly the same. But on this printed out picture, I drew a mark every inch on the top and the bottom. That way I'm able to connect the dots, line things up correctly, and keep the proportions the same. So I'm connecting the dots here. Make sure that you did line things up accurately and that none of these lines are tilted or out of place. If one of the lines is slightly tilted, it might throw off the proportions on your final portrait. So really take your time and make sure all the measurements and everything are as accurate as possible. So for the other side, it is 11 inches, so I'm making a mark every inch on the top and again the bottom, so make sure you do both sides so you can connect the dots and keep the proportions the same. So from here I would then go to my actual paper and make the same 1-inch by 1-inch grid, which I will show you in a minute. But I want to jump to Photoshop and show you the steps for putting together a grid in Photoshop. To get started, you should have your picture opened, and the first thing I'm going to do is change the image size and the canvas size. So since I'm working with an 8.5 by 11 for the actual drawing, I'm going to make sure that this image is 8.5 by 11 as well. So I can set up 1-inch by 1-inch grids on this. So to double check the size and change the size, you're going to go to Image at the top of Photoshop and click on Image Size. So my width is 26 inches by 35, so I definitely need to change that. I'm going to type 8.5, and since I want to keep the proportions the same, it's going to change my height as well. So 8.5 by 11.3. So on my final image, I want it to be 8.5 by 11. So that's when the canvas size is going to come into play, because you can't change this to 11. If you do, it's going to change your width as well. So I'm going to keep my width set to 8.5, and then I'll hit OK. And I'm going to go up and change the canvas size. So Image, Canvas Size, right underneath the image size. And this is where I can then change this to just 11 and keep my width set to 8.5. I'll hit OK. It says that the new canvas size is smaller, so it's going to crop a little bit out of my picture, and that's what you want. You want it to crop it so that it will be the same as your finished project. So I'm going to hit Proceed. It just took a little bit off the edge there. It was about 1/2 inch. And then I have my picture proportioned to my drawing. So the next step is adding your grid. I'm going to go up to Help in Photoshop and type in Grid. And there's two things you're going to do. The first is to set up the preferences for the grid. So this is where we're going to make sure that the grid lines will be 1-inch by 1-inch. So I'm going to click on my preferences, and I'm going to come down to Grid in the middle, and it says grid line every, and then I will set this to every 1 inch. That way, every single inch on here, there will be a grid or a grid line. So I'm going to hit OK. And then the second step is to actually add the grid or make the grid show up. So I already changed the setting. I'm going to go to Help, type in a grid again, and then click Show Grid, and that's going to bring the grid up. So this automatically draws it for you, and I can zoom in and again see some of those little details that would be hard to see on a printed out picture especially with Sharpie marks overlapping too much of the detail. So it's great to have this opened in Photoshop. So I'm going to jump back and start walking through the steps of putting together the inch by inch grid on the actual photo, which for the most part is pretty straightforward. But you just want to make sure that you're doing the same exact thing, making your marks every inch, and then jumping from the top to the bottom, making your 1 inch by 1 inch marks, and then you'll just connect the dots. So again, really important to just double check and make sure all your proportions are correct. You're drawing your grid lines evenly and getting things lined up the best you can. So that's how you will then be able to keep your proportions correct and accurate. Now, getting started using the grid to draw with, I'm going to make sure that I can find or pick a grid that has a good starting point. So I like to start with the eye, but you can really choose any grid that you want. And I'm just going to count over which grid number it is. So it's going to be 5 from the left, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 down. And I'm starting with that eye and just looking at some of the main details. So I'm not going to block in anything too small yet, but I'm looking at highlights, shadows, and a lot of the negative shapes and spaces. So look at any of the just general simple shapes that you can, and then slowly add detail as you go. Something else that helps if you're working in a detailed square, such as this one with the eye, is to split it in half so that you can use even smaller grids in those detailed areas to show more detail and to build more areas that have those smaller shadows and highlights to get as accurate drawings as possible. So if I divide my picture into fourths in the drawing, I'm going to divide it as well in my printed out picture. That way I can look at those details and just really try to get everything as accurate as possible. But again, I'm just outlining simple shapes and forms, looking at positive and negative space. I'm not too worried about looking at or guessing what a shape is. So I'm just going to be looking at the highlights and shadows and what those make up versus trying to outline the entire eyebrow and the eyes. So I'm looking at the forms and shapes instead. I'm going to kind of click through this so you can see. Again, you're just slowly adding all the details as you go. Try to really double check the boxes that you're working with. If you have Photoshop opened, I would definitely zoom in and try to really look at some of the detail that might be tough to see on your printed out picture.